The steel hull shuddered softly as the vessel eased forward beneath the Pacific swells. Thick clouds obscured the stars, and the moon was darkened behind a rim of distant mountains. In that blackness, a single slender mass slid through the surface and then vanished again. It rose only for an instant, just long enough for the man at the eyepiece to register the silhouettes of hulking shapes at anchor. He saw the dark line of a defensive boom, and he could almost sense the tension in the water as an entire convoy slumbered in a sheltered bay, unaware of the hunter that had come among them. No introduction came before this moment. There was only a submerged boat in enemy waters, a crew straining against the limits of their machines, and a strange habit that older officers had dismissed as useless. The slender mast would emerge briefly and disappear, always washed by the waves so that it left as little trace as possible. Deep below, the control room hummed with whispered commands. Each glimpse through the periscope was just a flash, a fragment of the scene above, but the officer in the attack center stitched those flashes into a complete picture. Habit made him raise and lower the instrument in a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. Around him, men sweated over valves and dials, listening to the whisper of screws and the occasional echo of a distant patrol boat. This was a crisis point. The submarine had penetrated defenses that the enemy believed were impenetrable. Minefields lay ahead, patrol craft hovered nearby, and the shallow depth offered little margin for error. Yet the captain was certain. He would rely on a technique that seemed like superstition to some, but which he believed could bring them safely through. When the first torpedoes left their tubes, a chain reaction began that would ripple across oceans in years. That calm surface, with its anchored merchantmen and slow-moving escorts, was the endpoint of many decisions made far from a danger. War at sea had become a contest between mathematics and nerves, between the physical limitations of machinery and the imagination of those who commanded them. At the beginning of the conflict, submarines were considered marauding raiders that attacked weakly defended targets and fled before heavier forces could respond. As the years dragged on, convoys grew larger and better protected. Surface escorts were fitted with cinemetric radar sets, such as the Type 271, that could detect a small target even through fog and darkness. British experiments with magnetron technology produced radar sets capable of detecting the faint return from a periscope at a range of roughly 900 yards. By the middle of the war, hundreds of corvettes and destroyers carried such sets. Air patrols from escort carriers and shore bases used radar and visual lookouts to sweep vast stretches of ocean for the telltale ripple of a periscope. Sound detection improved too. Allied scientists refined ASTIC and later sonar, giving escorts the ability to hear a submerged boat even when it kept its hull silent. The Convoy system, which had first been adopted in the previous war, was now a sophisticated machine of schedules, screening tactics, and layered defenses. To penetrate that system required more than bravery. It demanded an understanding of how the enemy perceived threats and where those perceptions could be manipulated. Inside the silent service, there were also debates about how to operate the available instruments. A periscope is a simple device in principle, a long tube with mirrors that allows a submerged vessel to see above the surface. Yet in practice, it was the most delicate and dangerous piece of equipment in the attack center. Because it protruded above the water and moved through the surface, it created ripples and a wake. A manual distributed to German commanders during the war warned that a periscope moving at even moderate speed leaves a visible trail on calm water, and that the splash of waves against the head could betray a boat's presence. To reduce that risk, the handbook instructed captains to use the periscope sparingly. They were told to raise it only for brief intervals, to keep it awash so that only the smallest part broke the surface, and to do so at low speed. Raising the periscope at high speed would leave a wake that could be seen from a distance. Keeping it down too long could be just as hazardous, because the boat would lose situational awareness and might collide with a ship or obstacle. The prescribed method was a series of rapid, repeated observations, each one lasting only a few seconds. Many old-school officers scoffed at the idea. They argued that one could not fight a battle if one spent most of the time blind. They preferred to keep the periscope up for extended periods, believing that constant surveillance was worth the risk of detection. They also doubted the value of new surface search radars fitted to submarines. Early sets were bulky, unreliable, and required the boat to be at or near the surface. When engineers proposed a miniature radar that could be integrated into the periscope itself, Some dismissed it as too fragile for combat. They feared that the extra equipment would make the mast heavier and more conspicuous. Tradition clashed with innovation within the tight confines of a pressure hull. There were, however, captains who saw possibilities in these untested tools. Among them was a man who commanded a fleet submarine in the Western Pacific during the final years of the conflict. He studied the habits of convoys and the patterns of their escorts. He read the enemy manuals that had been captured and pored over the instructions for sparing use of the periscope. He realized that the wake problem could be minimized by moving very slowly when the periscope was raised. He also recognized that a brief look could provide enough information when combined with radar. American submarines had been equipped with the SJ Surface Search Radar by the middle of the war, and this set could detect ships on the surface at night or through rain. A later development, the ST Periscope Radar, gave range and bearing information even when the periscope was just peeking above the waves. This captain insisted on having such equipment installed in his boat during overhaul, despite the misgivings of those who thought it would never work. An oral history from one of his officers recorded that after the overhaul, the submarine had a radar periscope that had to be carefully calibrated for accurate range. With this instrument, the captain could gather data without exposing his vessel any longer than necessary. He drilled his crew to raise the mast for only a heartbeat, memorize the scene, and then duck back into invisibility. Many of his peers still considered the technique akin to superstition. They called it a trick, a useless flourish that might impress novices but would never stand up to real combat. He responded that survival depended on reducing the time during which the enemy could see you. The trick, he said, was in repetition and timing. The enemy convoys he faced were the lifelines of a vast empire. Merchantmen carried ore and fuel from colonies to the factories that kept the war machine running. Troop transports ferried divisions from one front to another. Tankers supplied garrisons on remote islands. Destroyers and corvettes encircled these vessels, scanning for underwater predators. Aircraft circled overhead. Early in the war, these convoys lumbered along set routes. After grievous losses, they began zigzagging and taking coastal routes. Escort captains studied handbooks that told them what to look for. They knew that a periscope could appear as a narrow line, that a faint wake might betray a submerged foe. They also knew that a submarine at periscope depth could be detected by radar at close range. With the introduction of cinemetric radar, detection range for a periscope rose to about 900 yards, and contact could be held even in fog or darkness. The combination of radar and improved sonar made many convoy commanders confident that a single boat could not penetrate their screen unseen. Their confidence was bolstered by reports from pilots who claimed to spot periscopes with naked eyes from the air and by the weight of numbers. A convoy that filled an entire bay seemed immune to attack from below. It was under those assumptions that the convoy anchored in a bay along the Chinese coast settled for the night. The harbor was shallow, protected by islands and shoals that made navigation treacherous. The waters were strewn with mines. Patrol craft prowled the entrance. Anchored inside were dozens of merchant ships, tankers, and troop transports. Many had sailed from Formosa, others had loaded cargo in the East Indies. Their holds were full of supplies destined for garrisons on the Chinese mainland. They believed themselves safe because no one could imagine a submarine venturing into such confined waters. The escort commanders assumed that an attacker would have to keep its periscope up to navigate the shoals, and thus would be quickly spotted. They did not know that a vessel with a new instrument and an unorthodox technique was approaching on electric motors, trimmed so finely that its propellers barely disturbed the muddy bottom. The captain of the approaching submarine was Eugene Fluckey, commanding the United States Navy's USS Barb. He had already made a name for himself by exploiting radar to attack convoys at night, earning praise from Admiral Charles Lockwood, who said Fluckey's patrols demonstrated exactly how night radar and periscope attacks should be made. But this new operation would push the envelope further. His orders were to disrupt shipping along the Asian coast. When his radar picked up the concentration of ships in the bay, he decided to mount a surface attack from within their anchorage. Sailing on the surface would give him speed and the ability to launch more torpedoes quickly, but it would also make him an easy target if detected. Submerged, he would be slower and would have to thread through minefields and darkness. He chose the submerged approach, trusting his so-called periscope trick to guide him. In the hours after midnight, Barb made her run. Sound heads listened for mine-sweeping cables and the distant thump of patrol boats. The radar mast was retracted, and only the periscope, now fitted with a radar antenna on its head, pierced the surface. It rose for seconds, long enough for Flucky to see a dark mass ahead or for the radar to register a range tick. Then it sank again. Each glimpse revealed more of the harbor. Strings of cargo ships aligned like a wall, lights shielded but still glowing faintly behind canvas. The minefields had been laid to hinder deep draft vessels, leaving narrow channels the shallow draft submarine could exploit if it knew precisely where to turn. Flucky guided his boat through those channels using his mental map and the radar returns. When the boat reached firing position, he ordered the tubes flooded. 4 torpedoes left the bow and 4 left the stern in quick succession, each set to run shallow. The fish sped away silently. Seconds later, the quiet harbor erupted in flames. Torpedoes slammed into merchant hulls, blowing the lids off cargo holds. Ships that had been asleep now burned bright, and men scrambled on deck amid showers of sparks and splintered timber. In the chaos, searchlights swept the water, but the submarine had already swung its stern toward the exit channel. Flucky ordered full power. The electric motors whined, and the diesel engines came online as soon as there was enough depth for the boat to surface safely. The craft accelerated to a speed that pushed the limits of the machinery. According to one of the crewmen, after firing their torpedoes, they ran at high speed, reaching roughly 23 knots while tracking the bearings to prevent overheating. The escape route lay across shallow shoals and through a line of mines. The boat's draft was so shallow that it could pass over some mines without triggering them, but a miscalculation would have been fatal. Destroyers fired blindly into the water behind them, but their shells fell astern. The submarine's wake roared as it surged through the narrow channel. Once in deeper water, Flucky ordered a dive, and the boat disappeared beneath the surface. The patrol craft searched the area for hours, but the hunter was gone. Behind them, the anchored convoy burned, and its escorts could only pick up survivors and count losses. Flucky's daring raid on the harbor was not his only demonstration of the periscope technique. On earlier patrols, he had attacked convoys at night using radar and quick periscope glances. Admiral Lockwood noted that Flucky's approach showed how to combine radar and periscope observations to strike hard and vanish. His boat would approach at high speed on the surface under the cover of darkness and foul weather. As it closed, he would submerge and raise the periscope just enough for the radar antenna to get a range. Then he would lower it and adjust his course based on that data. Unlike other captains who kept the periscope up and risked detection, he would repeat this cycle as often as needed until he was in the center of the convoy. Once there, he would fire torpedoes at targets on both sides. Each torpedo had to be aimed without the benefit of a long periscope observation. He relied on calculation and the brief glimpses he had to set gyro angles. The method required discipline from the crew and precise understanding of their instruments. The success of the raid encouraged others to adopt similar tactics. The idea that a submarine could strike from inside a convoy without ever being seen seemed implausible until the charred hulls in that harbor testified to it. Not all periscope tricks involve radar. Earlier in the war, German Commander Gunther Prien had pioneered another type of deception when he followed a merchant ship in a scope of flow by positioning his submarine directly beneath the merchant's hull, using the noise of the merchant's propellers to mask his own. In another case, a German boat lashed a small fishing dory to its periscope so that it resembled a harmless fisherman when viewed from a distance. Some skippers even suggested placing a bird on top of the mast so that anyone who noticed it would assume it was driftwood or debris. Naval exercises after the war saw the crew of USS Devil use a similar ruse when they lashed a dory full of fake fishermen to the periscope to pass patrol boats in broad daylight. These ploys were inventive, but many officers regarded them as gimmicks that belonged in sea stories rather than in actual combat. The manual telling captains to raise the periscope briefly and at low speed was likewise sometimes ridiculed. Flucky's success forced a reevaluation. The so-called gamesmanship of disguising or briefly raising the periscope was no longer a novelty. It was a viable tactic that had sunk ships and broken a convoy's back. The mechanics of this victory illuminate the interplay between engineering, physics, and human judgment. A periscope is essentially a column of metal and glass that must balance between being tall enough to provide a line of sight above the waves and thin enough to minimize drag. When it moves through water at any speed, it creates turbulence. That turbulence breaks the surface, forming ripples that spread out in concentric circles in a V-shaped wake that can be seen from a distance. At high speed, the wake becomes foamy and leaves a track that even an inexperienced lookout could follow. At slow speed, the wake is less pronounced, and if the water is choppy, it may blend with natural waves. The U-boat manual's recommendation to raise the periscope for only a few seconds allowed the crew to study the surroundings and then vanish before those ripples drew attention. Submariners also learned to coordinate their observations with the roll of the waves. By timing the moment when a swell peaked, they could raise the periscope into the trough behind it, using the wave itself as a curtain. The ST radar added to this by allowing range and bearing measurements without requiring a prolonged visual observation. Engineering innovations did not stop with radar. Improvements to electric motors and batteries enabled submarines to run more quietly for longer periods. Gyro compasses and fire control computers allowed torpedo solutions to be calculated quickly, reducing the need for constant visual updates. The ability to flood and blow tanks rapidly gave a submarine the agility to pop up for an attack and then dive to evade. All these elements combined to make Flucky's raid possible. Human limits were tested as well. The crew had to memorize patterns of lights and masts during each brief glance. They had to work by feel in darkness, trusting the captain's judgment when he ordered turns based on mental maps. In the engine room, men monitored bearings and shafts, feeling for the slightest change in vibration that might signal impending failure. During the escape from the harbor, the engines were pushed beyond their usual limits. The oral history from one of the engineering officers recalls checking each bearing with a grease pencil to see if it was overheating while the boat sprinted at over 20 knots. There was no room for error. A torpedo misfire could have illuminated their position. A moment's hesitation in raising the periscope could have put them aground on a shoal. The cool detachment with which the attack was executed belied the strain on muscles and nerves. Men clung to their duties, hands steady as the deck vibrated around them. The technique of quick periscope glimpses demanded absolute confidence in each other and in the machines they served. When news of the raid reached command headquarters, the reaction was a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Admiral Lockwood, commander of submarine forces in the Pacific, telegraphed congratulations and used the patrol report as an example to be studied. At training schools, instructors who had previously derided the brief periscope observation as impractical began to incorporate it into their curricula. The Navy accelerated the deployment of ST radar and other periscope improvements. Tactics manuals were rewritten to emphasize the importance of combining radar data with quick visual checks and to caution that leaving the periscope up for more than a few seconds could lead to disaster. Captains who had once insisted on long periscope observations were compelled to rethink their procedures. Escort commanders, for their part, reviewed their own practices. They realized that a skilled opponent could slip past radar at close range by minimizing exposure time and moving slowly. They began to increase the number of random depth charge drops and to assume that any unexplained disturbance might be a submarine. Engineers working on Type 271 and similar radars sought ways to improve resolution and reduce the time needed to form a picture. The interplay between offense and defense intensified. Psychologically, the raid had an outsized impact. Sailors who had believed harbors were sanctuaries now looked at the water with suspicion. Reports from survivors described the terror of explosions in what had been considered safe anchorages. Rumors spread that American submarines could run through minefields at full speed and strike without ever showing a periscope. These stories were exaggerated, but they served the purpose of sowing doubt. For the crews of submarines, the success validated their belief that engineering and discipline could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. It also reinforced the importance of systemic thinking. The periscope trick did not work because of an individual flash of inspiration alone. It worked because the captain understood the rules of physics, the capabilities and limitations of his equipment, the psychology of his adversaries, and the geometry of the harbor he attacked. He applied pressure methodically, not heroically. The result was the destruction of several enemy ships and the paralysis of an entire convoy. After the raid, shipping in the region decreased. Escorts became more cautious. Convoys were diverted to less efficient routes. Mines were laid more thickly. All of this strained an already overextended logistics network. In the longer term, the episode contributed to a shift in submarine doctrine. The post-war analysis of submarine operations concluded that reliance on stealth and surprise, coupled with technological advantage, produced results disproportionate to the size of the force. This analysis influenced the design of post-war submarines, which placed greater emphasis on submerged endurance, quiet propulsion, and sensor integration. The periscope itself evolved. Eventually, photonics mass replaced traditional periscopes, and electronic displays replaced eyepieces. But the core lesson remained. Exposing yourself only briefly reduces the adversary's reaction time and magnifies your own. Future submarine captains continued to drill their crews in the art of popping the mast up for a second, absorbing the necessary information, and then sinking back into the opaque sea. Radar and sonar improved, but the principle of minimizing exposure time endured. By the time the next generation of submarines entered service, the idea of running with the periscope up for long periods seemed archaic. The once ridiculed trick had become standard practice. The raid on the Chinese coast came near the end of a global conflict that had consumed millions of lives and reshaped entire societies. Yet its significance is best understood not in the number of ships sunk or the tonnage destroyed, but in the way it exemplified the interplay between individual initiative and systemic forces. The submarine's success did not hinge on chance. It hinged on the ability of its captain to see beyond conventional wisdom, to integrate emerging technologies, and to train his crew to execute a demanding procedure flawlessly under pressure. It also hinged on the complacency of defenders who believed certain rules would protect them. When those rules broke down, the shock reverberated far beyond the harbor. The system of convoy protection, so carefully built, suddenly appeared vulnerable. The aura of invincibility around safe anchorages was shattered. Doctrine shifted accordingly. In a cold, quiet analysis, the episode underscores that war at sea is won not by spectacle, but by method. The periscope trick that some called useless turned out to be a logical application of physics and human perception. It saved the attacking submarine from detection and enabled it to operate where the enemy thought it could not. The destruction of a convoy without being seen was not an act of divine luck, but the result of understanding, patience, and the courage to trust an untested approach. In the end, there were no cheers or triumphant speeches as the submarine slipped back into the depths. There was only the rhythmic hum of machinery, the faint echoes of distant explosions, and the knowledge that a small adjustment in procedure had altered the course of a naval campaign. The war moved on, impersonal and relentless. Human beings continued to serve in the machines built to contest it. The legacy of that night remained, embedded in manuals, drilled into trainees, and remembered by those who survived. It is a legacy not of glory, but of adaptation, a reminder that even in the vastness of the ocean, sometimes the smallest change, the fleeting lift of a periscope, can tip the balance.